Okay, so we're diving into a pretty big topic today, the potential elimination of the Department of Education.
Yeah, it's a big one for sure.
Definitely. And we've got a lot of information. We've gathered different perspectives, reports, the whole nine yards.
A lot to unpack.
Yeah, absolutely. So we really want to break down what are the main arguments, what could this actually mean for education if it were to happen,
Right.
all that good stuff. And, while we're at it, if you're finding this interesting, hit that like button, subscribe. You know what that is.
Keeps us going.
Keeps us going. All right, so jumping in, when you look at this whole issue, it seems like a really fundamental question about, who gets to decide how education works in the U.S.
Yeah, it's about like the balance of power, right? Yeah. Federal government versus individual states, that whole debate.
Right, exactly. So let's start with, why is this even a thing? Why are we talking about getting rid of the DOE?
Well, there's this bill, HR 3269, called the States Education Reclamation Act of 2025. And it's basically saying, hey, the Constitution says education is a state and local issue, not a federal one.
So they're saying the DOE shouldn't even exist.
Yeah, pretty much. They believe decisions about education should be made closer to home, by the people who are actually in the schools every day.
So parents, teachers, local school boards, that kind of thing.
Exactly. They argue that those folks are the ones who truly understand the needs of their students and communities.
Makes sense. But what about the argument that the DOE helps ensure equal access to education for everyone?
That's a big one from the other side, for sure. They say the DOE plays a crucial role in enforcing civil rights laws, making sure all students, regardless of background, get a fair shot.
So protecting students from discrimination.
Exactly. And they also point to programs like IDEA for students with disabilities and Title I, which provides funding for schools in low-income areas.
We had Representative Khanna warn that eliminating the DOE would be detrimental to any neighborhood with a public school receiving Title I funds.
And, it's not just about equality. The DOE also helps with things like student loans, educational research, providing national leadership.
Right. I was going to say, doesn't the DOE handle things like Pell Grants and federal student loans? I remember that being a big part of how I paid for college.
That's right. Though this bill, HR 369, wants to move those programs to the Treasury Department.
Interesting. And what about the research aspect? Studying what works in education, collecting data.
Yeah, the DOE supports that, too, through agencies like the Institute of Education Sciences and the National Center for Education Statistics.
So gathering information that can help improve education across the board.
Exactly. And then there's the idea of the DOE providing a kind of national direction for education.
Right. So instead of 50 states all doing their own completely separate thing.
Exactly. The DOE tries to set some standards, offer guidance, that kind of thing.
Okay, so we've got a better sense of why some people want to keep the DOE. But let's go back to those who want to get rid of it. What's their reasoning besides the whole states' rights thing?
Well, one argument is that the DOE creates too much bureaucracy.
Too much red tape.
Yeah. They say it leads to inefficiency, overregulation, too much focus on standardized testing, all that.
And they also say it takes power away from parents and local communities.
Right. They feel like the DOE is actually weakened local control over schools.
So it's like this big federal entity that's kind of imposing its will on everyone.
That's the idea. And then there's the financial argument. They say the DOE itself costs a lot of money to run, money that could be better spent elsewhere.
Like in the classrooms themselves.
Exactly. The bill actually compares the average salary of a DOE employee to that of a public school teacher to make that point.
I can see how that would be a compelling argument for some people.
And there's this idea that having the DOE creates too much uniformity in education across the country.
So like a one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't really work.
Right. They argue that different states and communities have different needs and should be able to tailor their education systems accordingly.
Okay, but Representative Bonamici countered that states and local school boards already have a lot of authority. She said the DOE doesn't control curriculum or class sizes.
Right. So she's basically saying, hold on, the federal government isn't as involved as you're making it seem.
All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of what would happen if the DOE were actually eliminated. This bill, HR 369, lays out a plan for how education funding would work, right?
Yeah, it basically says that instead of going through the DOE, the money would go directly to the states as grants from the Treasury Department.
So cutting out the middleman.
Right. And the states would have more freedom to decide how to use that money.
Would there be any kind of oversight to make sure states are using the money responsibly?
Yeah, the bill proposes annual audits and requires states to submit reports on how the funds are being used,
And what about those programs we talked about earlier, the ones that might be moved to other departments?
right? Like job training going to the Department of Labor, special education grants going to Health and Human Services, and so on.
So the federal government would still be involved in those areas, just through different channels.
Exactly. But there are definitely concerns about what could happen if the DOE is gone.
Like what?
Well, some people worry that it could lead to greater inequality in education. Some states might do a great job supporting all students, while others might fall short.
And without the DOE to enforce civil rights laws, certain groups of students could be left behind.
Right. And Representative Bonamici specifically mentioned concerns about students with disabilities and those in rural areas.
And we talked about the financial impact, too, how states and school districts could lose funding.
Yeah, we use Connecticut as an example. They get a decent chunk of their education budget from the federal government. And SIG districts, like Bridgeport, rely on that funding even more heavily.
And Representative Hayes pointed out that without that federal money, some towns and cities might have to cut other services or raise taxes to make up the difference.
Right. And then there's the big picture question of losing that national leadership and coordination that the DOE provides.
Right. So it's a lot to think about. On one hand, you have the argument for more local control, less bureaucracy. On the other hand, there's the concern about equity funding and losing that national perspective.
And I think that's the real crux of this whole debate. How do we balance those competing priorities?
It's definitely a complex issue with no easy answers. We've explored the main arguments for and against eliminating the Department of Education. We've looked at how funding might change, what programs could be moved, and the potential impact on states and local communities.
And I think it's important to remember that this isn't just about rearranging some government agencies. It's about the fundamental role of the federal government in education.
Right. Ultimately, it's a question for all of us to grapple with. How do we create an education system that truly serves all students, regardless of where they live or what their background is?
Exactly. And that's something worth thinking about long and hard. So we encourage you to check out the sources we've mentioned, dig deeper, and form your own opinions.
Absolutely. And thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the potential elimination of the Department of Education.